Marriages among the nobility, you must understand, are not forged in heaven. They are forged in ledgers, in the cold arithmetic of acreage and debt, in the particular hush that falls over a drawing room when a father calculates his daughter's worth against a title's need. Love is not the currency of the ton, but sometimes, on the rarest occasions, a debt of an older, gentler kind slips through the cracks of that arithmetic and finds its way home. This is the story of 8 shillings, a length of chestnut hair, and a ribbon that remembered a name no one else had dared to speak in 30 years. Before any duke came looking, there was only a cellar and a girl counting coins by candle stub. The room smelled of tallow smoke and river damp, the particular cold of Southwark in February that settled into stone and stayed there, indifferent to fires. She knelt on the packed earth floor with 3 copper coins and 1 worn shilling arranged before her like a hand of cards she had already lost, and she counted them again, though she had counted them twice already and knew, with the flat certainty of the truly poor, that they would not multiply for the counting. Behind her, in the room's single bed, her sisters slept in a tangle of shawls and each other's warmth, the youngest with her thumb near her mouth, though she was near 6 and thought herself too old for it, the middle one coughing softly in her sleep, a sound that had begun 3 days ago and had not left, the eldest, 11, with one arm flung protectively across the other 2 even in dreaming. Above them, through the room's single high window, London went about its business of rain. She was 20, and she was beautiful in the particular way that made other poor women's mouths go thin when she passed. Not the beauty of ribbons and leisure, but something starker, cheekbones sharpened by hunger, and eyes that had learned early not to plead. It had gotten her nothing yet but trouble and a landlord's lingering glances, and she had long since stopped thinking of it as anything but another expense to manage, like the coal or the coughing. The coal was gone, had been gone since Tuesday. The landlord had come that morning, stamping rain from his boots onto her clean-swept floor, and named a figure that was not a number so much as a verdict. 3 days, he'd said. 3 days or find the street more accommodating than I have been. She had not answered him. There was nothing to answer with. Now, in the low hours, with her sisters breathing evenly behind her and the coins refusing their 4th counting, she reached instead for the one thing in the room that had not yet been sold, pawned, or burned for warmth, the great weight of chestnut hair that fell, uncut, past her waist, catching what little candlelight remained like something out of a life she no longer quite believed she'd had a right to. She lifted a hank of it in her fist and did not let herself think further than the weighing of it. It took less courage than she expected, and more than she had left to spare. She wrapped what remained of the night's candle stub in her shawl, checked the banked coals one final time, though there were none to bank, and pressed a kiss to each small forehead in turn, the eldest first, because she stirred easiest, then the middle, then the smallest, whose cough had softened but not stopped. She left a note she did not need to write, since none of them could read past their letters yet, and went out into the sleet, because there was nothing else to be done with a Thursday morning that had arrived, owing her nothing. The walk to the wig-maker's took the better part of an hour, though it was not, strictly, far, only that the streets between Southwark and the shop on Cheapside seemed determined to punish her for the errand, sleet turning to a fine, cold rain that found the seams of her boots and stayed there. She kept one hand pressed to the braid coiled beneath her bonnet the whole way, as a woman might hold a wound closed. The shop, when she reached it, smelled of tallow and orris root, and something Swedish beneath, like hair kept too long in a drawer. The wig-maker was a small, precise man with spectacles pushed up into thinning gray curls of his own, and he did not so much greet her as assess her, walking a slow circle while she stood with her chin lifted and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way she had learned to stand for landlords and magistrates and anyone else entitled to look at her as though she were a parcel of goods. Waist length, he said, more to himself than to her, untouched by dye, good color, chestnut, and thick. He named a figure, 8 shillings. She did not haggle, because she had nothing to haggle with beyond the hair itself, and because 8 shillings was coal, and bread, and perhaps, if she was careful, if she was very careful, 3 more days beyond what the landlord had allowed her. She sat where he directed her, on a stool before a spotted mirror, and watched a stranger's face watch her back, while his shears found the base of her neck. She had thought she would not mind it. She minded it. The weight left her all at once, shockingly light, like a held breath finally let go, and for one unguarded moment her hand rose to the shorn ends at her nape, and her throat closed around something she refused to call grief. She kept the braid in her lap a moment longer than she needed to, working the faded blue ribbon looser at its end, running her thumb once over the raised threads of a crest she had never been able to read, and had never thought to ask after. Then she set it, ribbon and all, into the wig-maker's waiting hands, took her 8 shillings, and did not look back at the mirror on her way out. A house may be grand and still be cold. That is the particular cruelty of inheritance. That stone does not warm simply because a family has owned it for 300 years. The townhouse in question had 40 rooms and fires lit in perhaps 6 of them, and the man who moved through its corridors that afternoon had long since stopped noticing the difference between the 2 kinds of cold, the one in the air and the one that lived in him. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, though he took up no more space than courtesy required. Early 30s, dark-coated, moving with the careful economy of a man who had trained himself out of restlessness. Servants stepped aside for him, not from fear exactly, but from the sense that his silences carried weight, and that filling them uninvited was a kind of trespass. He had not smiled in the hearing of his own household in longer than any of them could name, though the housekeeper, who had known him since he was small, sometimes said he had not always been so. He climbed to his mother's rooms carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string, and did not examine why his jaw had tightened on the stairs, why his hand found the banister more firmly than the shallow steps required. The banister, at least, was honest. It did not ask him to remember. His mother's chamber was overheated by design, physician's orders, against the damp that settled in her chest each winter and would not, this year, entirely lift. She lay propped on pillows the color of old ivory, thinner than she had been in autumn, her hair, what remained of it, thin as a child's. She had been vain once. She had earned the right. "You've brought me something," she said, before he had crossed the threshold, her eyes going to the parcel with more hunger than dignity allowed. A trifle. He set it in her lap and did not sit, though a chair had been placed for him, as it always was, and always went unused. She unwrapped it slowly. Her hands did everything slowly now, and when the wig emerged, dark and glossy and absurdly, extravagantly full, she laughed, a small dry sound like paper folding, and pressed it to her own thin scalp with something close to delight. "Chestnut," she said. "Real hair. Whoever sold this must have needed the money badly." He said nothing to that. He was looking, instead, at the length of ribbon still knotted loosely about the braid's end where the wig-maker had left it. Faded blue, once fine, embroidered along its edge with a small raised crest gone soft with handling. Something in him went very still, the way a house goes still before a storm reaches the lake below it, and for one unguarded instant he was 11 years old again, cold to the bone, and being pulled by the collar out of black water by hands that wore that exact blue. He did not move for a long moment, and his mother, who had spent 30 years learning the weather of her son's face, mistook his stillness for grief over her thinning scalp, and patted the sofa beside her, murmuring that it was only hair, that vanity was a young man's luxury she'd long since surrendered. He said something in answer. Some small, obedient thing, about how hair grew back and health mattered more than curls, but the words came from the part of him that had learned, at 9 years old, to speak comfortingly while his whole chest was full of ice. He excused himself soon after, citing correspondence, and his mother let him go with the indulgent sigh of a woman who believed her son's silences were simply the shape of men. She could not have known that he carried the ribbon in his waistcoat pocket like a coal that would not cool, and that the wig now resting on its stand in her chamber had become, in the space of an afternoon, something closer to a relic than a gift. Alone in his study, with the fire guttering low and the rain still needling the windows, he allowed himself to remember what he had spent 26 years training himself not to. The lake had been black that February, black and skinned with ice thin enough to crack like a communion wafer. He remembered the cold not as a sensation but as an absence, the moment the world simply stopped being warm, stopped being kind, stopped being anything but water closing over his head. He remembered his father's coat sinking ahead of him, dragged down by the very ledger book stuffed into its lining, as though a man might weight himself with his own ruin and call it penance. He remembered thinking, with the strange clarity of the drowning, that he was already resigned, already going, already gone. And then a hand, a fist of wool and grip and fury closing around his collar, hauling him up through water that fought to keep him, a woman's voice above the surface, shouting his name like an accusation, like a prayer. She had pulled him out first, always him first, though her own skirts were leaden with the lake and her lips had gone the color of the sky. She had not managed his father in time. She had stayed after, dried his hair before the nursery fire with her own shawl, told no one what she'd seen him almost choose in that last still moment before her hand found him, and then, within the year, in the chaos that followed the old Duke's death, the solicitors, the black crepe, the scramble of relations circling the title like crows over a carcass. She was simply gone, no notice given, no wages collected. A woman who had saved an heir's life and vanished from the house as though she had never drawn breath in it, as though gratitude were a debt the family had quietly decided not to honor. He had asked, once, as a boy, where she'd gone. He had been told, gently, to stop asking. He had stopped. For 26 years he had stopped. He unfolded the ribbon now in the firelight, tracing the crest with his thumb the way he had traced it as a child without ever learning to read its meaning, and understood, with a coldness far worse than any lake, that he was about to start asking again. A duke does not go looking for wig-makers himself. He sends a man for that, a steward, a solicitor, someone whose shoes are made for mud. But grief has a way of making a man forget which errands are beneath him, and by morning he was in the carriage himself, the ribbon folded into his breast pocket like a letter he could not yet bring himself to answer. The wig-maker remembered the braid the way tradesmen remember anything that pays well, precisely and with a wariness that suggested he expected to be accused of some wrongdoing merely for having profited by it. 8 shillings, he said, as though the sum itself were a kind of alibi. A girl had come in 8 days past, chestnut hair to her waist, cutted herself with kitchen shears before she'd even crossed the threshold, poor thing, though pretty enough that he'd wondered why she hadn't sold something else first. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't asked much of anything. Business did not require it. But he remembered the ribbon, because he'd nearly kept it, thought it might fetch something on its own, being embroidered so, and had only parted with it because the girl had asked, quiet but firm, if she might have it back, and something in her face had made him not want to argue the point for a few extra pence. Where had she gone after, though? That he did not know, but there was a pawnbroker 2 streets on who dealt in the same trade of small desperations, and if she'd needed coal as well as bread, she'd have gone there next. Everyone did. The pawnbroker's shop smelled of tallow and old brass, and the man behind the counter had the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to ask questions of the people who come to him, only of the objects they bring. He did not remember a girl with cropped hair. There were, he said not unkindly, a great many girls with cropped hair this winter, it being a hard one, and cropped hair being cheaper to keep than fed mouths. But he remembered a ribbon like that, once, years back, brought in by a woman selling notions, thread, buttons, trims, that sort of thing, up and down these streets for as long as he'd kept his shop. She'd had a whole roll of them, blue, crested, said they'd come from a house in the country that had turned her off without character. He hadn't asked which house, he hadn't cared to know. But she still came round sometimes, he said. A ribbon seller with a basket and a bad hip worked the market off Union Street of a Tuesday. It was not a Tuesday. The Duke of Halstead stood in that shop a long moment nonetheless, turning the coincidence over as though it might yield a different answer if pressed hard enough, and then went out into the rain to find somewhere to wait 5 days that did not feel, to a man of his position, indecent. He did not wait well. A man accustomed to waiting only for other men to finish speaking found the 5 days a species of torment he had no name for, not grief, not quite hope, something thinner and more restless that kept him at his club until the candles guttered, and then walking, of all indignities, the wet streets alone at hours no duke should be seen walking them. On the 5th day, a Tuesday, the rain thinned to a gray mist, and he went to Union Street with his collar up and his hat pulled low, as if disguise were possible for a man whose carriage alone announced him 3 streets off. He left the carriage 2 streets off instead. The market was noise and mud and the smell of fish and tallow, stalls thrown up against the damp like a fortification. He found the ribbon seller by her basket before he found her face. A great wicker thing bristling with spools, blues and greens, and a faded crimson, and beside it a small bent woman with a shawl pinned at the throat, and eyes that had gone the milky color of a woman past 60, who has spent her life threading needles in poor light. He did not announce himself. He simply held out the ribbon, the crest turned up, and watched her face. She went very still. Her hand came up slow, as if the ribbon might startle and run, and she took it from him and turned it over twice, thumb pressing into the worn embroidery the way a woman presses a bruise to see if it still hurts. She marked them all this way, the old woman said. Corner stitch, see, that little knot there, plain thread, so it wouldn't show against the pattern. Her own mark. I told her once, she oughtn't bother, nobody'd ever look close enough to notice, and she said someone might. Someday, she was particular that way. You knew her? I knew of her. Bought trims off her when she still had a basket like mine, before. The old woman stopped, weighed something, and went on more carefully. Before her circumstances changed. She'd a temper for pride, that one, wouldn't take charity, wouldn't say why she'd left the house she'd left, just sold what she had off a house that turned her out. Good ribbon, real threadwork, better than anything I could get honest. I always thought there was a story in it, never asked. Wasn't my place. Where does she live? The old woman's milky eyes sharpened on him then, taking in the coat, the boots, the carriage-shaped absence of him standing where a carriage ought to be. She's long dead, sir, if it's her you're after. Years now. But she'd a daughter kept the trade going a while. Sold what was left when the coal ran short. Southwark. Cellar room off Crucifix Lane by the tanner's yard. You'll know it by the smell before you know it by the door. He did not thank her properly. He was already turning, already counting streets, already feeling the cold air move differently in his chest than it had all week, sharper, nearer, like weather changing before a storm breaks. The cellar, that same evening, knew nothing yet of carriages or crests. It knew only the particular economy of a room where every sound had to earn its place. The drip from the ceiling counted, the settling coal counted, the smallest sister's cough counted most of all, because it had a wet rattle in it now that had not been there a week before. She knelt by the pallet and pressed a hand to the child's chest, feeling for the tightness under the ribs. The way her mother had taught her before her mother was only a shape she remembered, rather than a voice. Hush now. Breathe slow. Like a candle you don't want to blow out. The girl obeyed, 6 years old and already fluent in the grammar of not being any trouble, and the coughing eased into something that could pass, if you were generous, for sleep. There was a heel of bread left, hard as a doorstop, and she broke it into 3 pieces with more care than the bread deserved, weighing each in her palm before setting it on the ledge for morning. The middle sister, 9 and always half awake, watched her do this with the flat attention of a child who has learned to read a room by its rationing. The eldest, 11, said nothing at all, only tucked the blanket tighter round the small one's shoulders, and looked at her sister with the particular gravity of someone old enough to do sums. 8 shillings and 6 of them already spent. Coal, a twist of tea, a chicken's worth of bones for broth, a poultice for the cough, that had not, in the end, worked as well as promised. She had counted the remaining coins twice before supper and once again after, as though the act of counting might multiply them, and both times they came to the same small, insufficient sum. It was into this arithmetic that the landlord arrived, not troubling to knock, his lamp throwing his shadow long and wet across the threshold. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He had learned that quiet was more frightening in a room this size, and said only that the rent was a fortnight gone, and that Tuesday, if it was not made whole, the room would want new tenants. He looked, as he said it, not at her face but at the door, the walls, the pallet, cataloguing what might be sold or seized, the way a man looks at a house he expects soon to own. She said she would have it. She did not know how. She said it anyway, because the alternative was to say it in front of 3 children who were pretending very hard to be asleep, and some cruelties a person simply declines to commit, even when honesty would recommend them. When the door shut behind him, she stood a long moment in the dark, one hand still resting on the small one's chest, feeling the little ribs rise and fall, and told herself, as she told herself most nights now, that morning was a problem for morning, even as, above the cellar, in the wet black street, a step she did not yet know to listen for was drawing steadily nearer. The step came at 9:30, when the rain had thickened from mist to a proper assault, drumming the air-away stones above the cellar window like fingers demanding entry. She heard it long before it stopped, a man's stride, unhurried, unlike the landlord's shuffling threat or the quick, guilty scurry of boys who came round testing doors. This step did not care who heard it. This step expected the street to yield. She was on her feet before she knew she had risen, the poker already in her hand from where it leaned by the grate, its iron cold and familiar as a second wrist. The little ones lay in their heap of shawls, the middle one's breath still catching on that persistent wet-weather cough, and she moved without sound between them and the door, positioning her own thin body as though it were a wall of far sturdier stone. The knock, when it came, was not the landlord's knock. It was one knock only, and then silence. A man giving the room time to decide whether it wished to be found. "Who's there?" she said, and was ashamed of how her voice shook even as she kept the poker raised. No answer but the rain, and then, low through the door's rotten seam, "I mean no harm to you or the children." A bailiff would have said he meant business, not harm. A thief would not have knocked at all. She understood neither of these distinctions in the moment. She understood only that a strange man's voice knew there were children, and that this knowledge alone was violation enough to justify every ounce of the fire iron's weight in her grip. "Then you'll say your business through the door," she said, "and be glad I don't open it." There was a pause long enough that she thought he might simply go, that whatever error had brought him to a cellar door in Southwark on a night like this would correct itself and walk away into the wet dark where it belonged. Instead, she heard the small, deliberate sound of a latch being tried, gently, without force, as though testing whether the room itself would object before the man did. "Don't," she said, and the word came out sharper than she'd meant. Sharp enough that behind her the smallest sister stirred in her sleep, murmured something wordless, and went still again. The door was not locked. There had never been money enough for a lock worth the name, and it gave inward on its own rotten hinge before she could brace it, swinging to reveal, framed in the gray wet light of the Arroway stair, a tall man in a dark greatcoat gone black with rain, hatless already or made so by the weather, water running from his hair down a face she could not read for shadow. She raised the poker higher, angling her body so that the door, the man, whatever he intended, would have to pass through her first to reach the sleeping shapes behind. Her shorn hair, still strange and light against her neck, seemed suddenly the most vulnerable thing about her, as though its absence had stripped away some final layer of armor she hadn't known she possessed. "One more step," she said, "and I'll not answer for your skull." He did not step forward. That, more than anything, was what made her lower the poker an inch. Not trust, never trust, but the strange stillness of a man who had come to be stopped. He looked at the iron in her hands the way another man might look at a loaded pistol he deserved to have aimed at him, and then, slowly, he did the one thing no man of his coat and boots and bearing had ever done in that cellar or any like it. He took off his hat. It was a small gesture, and it meant nothing, she told herself. Hats came off for weather, for doorways, for nothing at all. But he held it against his chest, the way a man holds a hat at a graveside, and something in her chest tightened before her mind had caught up to why. Then he went down on one knee on the wet stone floor, in the mud and the coal dust and the filth of her rented poverty, and the fine dark wool of his coat drank the damp up greedily, and he did not seem to notice or care. "I am not here to take anything from you," he said. His voice was low, roughened by rain or by something else. "I came for a ribbon, blue, embroidered, sold with a length of chestnut hair 8 days past, to a wig-maker on the Strand." His eyes went to her cropped head, and did not flinch from it, and that too undid her a little. "I know whose it was. It was my mother's." She said it the way one says a fact learned too young to question, flat, unadorned, a fence around a grief she had built long ago and maintained ever since. "Your mother's name," he said, "was Wren, before it was ever spoken in a nursery at Halstead. She was nursemaid there 30 years gone. She pulled a boy of 6 from a frozen lake with her own 2 hands and her own 2 arms, when his father had meant that lake to be the last debt he ever paid." He swallowed. "I was that boy." The poker did not fall from her hands so much as become suddenly, absurdly heavy, a weight she no longer had the strength to justify holding. She heard herself say, "You are mistaken," though nothing in her voice believed it, and behind her, one of the sisters, the eldest, always the lightest sleeper, stirred and sat half up on the pallet, blinking at the kneeling stranger with the frank, unfrightened curiosity only a child roused too fast from sleep can manage. "I traced the ribbon through 3 shops to find you," he said, still kneeling, still hatless, water pooling now beneath his knee on the stone. "I did not come to give you coin." His jaw worked once, as though the next words cost him something long hoarded. "I came to give you back your mother's name." Grief cracked through her disbelief like ice giving way beneath a boot, and she found she could no longer tell if the wet on her face was the rain he'd carried in with him, or her own. The name he gave her that night in the cellar was not the sort a woman could put back in a drawer and forget. It followed her up the narrow stair the next morning, followed her into the carriage he sent. Plain, unmarked, no crest upon the door, for he was not yet fool enough to announce what he had not yet decided how to announce. And it followed her still as the wheels turned from the black lanes of Southwark onto the wider roads that led, mile by wet mile, toward a house she had only ever imagined, the way the poor imagine heaven, as a place that existed for other people. The sisters pressed their faces to the glass and said nothing, because wonder in children that age often looks exactly like silence. She held the eldest's hand and did not look out at all, watching instead the toes of her own worn boots, as though by refusing to see the house approach she might delay whatever judgment waited at the end of the drive. It waited regardless, stone the color of old bone, ivy stripped bare by February, windows lit gold against a sky the color of dishwater, and at the top of the steps, a household arranged with the particular stillness of people who have been told to receive someone and have decided, silently, unanimously, not to receive them warmly. The housekeeper's eyes went first to the girl's cropped hair, then to the sister's patched hems, then to the Duke's face, searching it for an explanation he did not offer. A footman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, something closer to disbelief trying to arrange itself into propriety. Somewhere behind the assembled staff, a voice, pitched low but not low enough, murmured something about Southwark, an ribbon, and whoever heard of such a thing? And the words moved through the line of servants the way a draft moves through an unshut door, felt by everyone, traced to no one. Then came the aunt. She descended the steps in dove-gray silk entirely unsuited to the weather, as though she had dressed for a battle she intended to win by appearance alone, and her gaze took in the girl, the shorn head, the ribbon now pinned instead of tied, the 3 small sisters clustered like chicks in a yard full of hawks, with the particular contempt of a woman who has spent 40 years believing that blood and money were the same substance, and here was proof, apparently, that they were not. "You cannot mean," she said to her nephew, not troubling to lower her voice at all now, "to bring Southwark to my brother's door. I mean to bring home the daughter of the woman who kept me from drowning in that lake," he said, and something in his voice closed the matter the way a door closes on a draft. Not gently, but finally. The aunt's mouth thinned into a line that promised letters would be written, and written that very evening, to every drawing-room in London that still owed her a favor. The girl felt the weight of that unspoken correspondence settle over her shoulders like a wet cloak, even as the Duke offered his arm at the foot of the steps, not to her waist, not to her hand, only his arm, formal as a bow, and did not withdraw it, though the whole house was watching to see if he would. She took the arm because refusing it, here, on these steps, in front of a housekeeper and 2 footmen and a scullery maid who had all stopped their work to watch, would have been its own kind of cruelty. To him, she realized, as much as to herself. He had said the thing aloud. He had said it in his aunt's hearing, in the hearing of servants who would carry it below stairs before the soup was served, and out to the village before the church bells rang Sunday, and there was no unsaying it now, no folding it back into the quiet of a cellar room where such truths could be turned over privately by candlelight, and no one the wiser. Her sisters pressed close against her skirts, the youngest still clutching the corner of a blanket someone had thought to wrap her in for the carriage ride, the eldest staring up at the house's gray stone face with an expression too old for 11 years. Wonder fighting suspicion, and losing, slowly, to wonder. A housemaid dropped a small, unpracticed curtsy in the girl's direction, uncertain whether it was owed, and the aunt made a sound in her throat like a kettle just beginning to protest the fire. "They will not receive her," the aunt said, "to no one, to everyone. Not at the Ashworth ball, not at Lady Fenwick's card evenings, not anywhere a name matters. Then they will not receive me either," the Duke said, without heat, as though remarking on the weather, "for I mean to say her mother's name in every room I enter, until it stops sounding strange to them." It was not a declaration of love. She understood that much, standing there in her borrowed shawl with coal dust still gray beneath her fingernails. No amount of washing had yet lifted. It was something narrower and, perhaps, sturdier than love, a debt acknowledged in daylight, a name restored to the air it had been driven out of 20 years before. And yet when his eyes found hers again, briefly, before he turned to hand the aunt into her own carriage, with a courtesy that was almost cruel in its correctness, there was a question in them that no ledger of debts could account for. The rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, though neither of them had noticed it stopping. Somewhere above the house's high slate roofline, the cloud had thinned enough to let a single band of pale February sun fall across the wet gravel drive, catching for a moment on the shorn ends of her hair beneath her bonnet, on the blue thread of ribbon he had pressed back into her hand that morning, and which she had, without quite deciding to, tied once more around her wrist. The staff would talk. The aunt would write her letters. The ton would do what the ton always did, with a scandal too interesting to ignore and too well connected to dismiss outright. But the girl who had sold her hair for 8 shillings in February stood now on a duke's threshold with her sisters safe beside her, her mother's name spoken aloud at last, and whatever else remained unspoken between them could wait, she thought, for a warmer